Okay, I've got to go. Welcome, everyone. I'm Kjell Magne Fagerbakke. I will hosting this session. This is an event in the globalisation conference hosted by BN Norway and are technically supported by the Norwegian Social Forum. We have, we call this session Reclaim the Commons and discuss the importance of free and just use of of the commons. The value of the commons are not restricted to anyone, and a universal basic income is a well-documented method where all can be, we all can have a fair share of it. We have a brilliant panel. We have a brilliant panel that each shall give us a brief introduction, and then we will have a conversation afterwards and answer some questions. Rahul Basu from Goa Foundation, Bady Balde, IT, and Guy Standing, writer and the founder of BN. We will start with Rahul. Just give you. We will start with Rahul from Goa Foundation. He is a research director there, and this foundation have been for years fighting the biggest environmental issue in Goa, the mining. Okay, you can tell more about it, Rahul. Please take on.
Okay. Thank you, Kjell. Thank you, BN Norway and the Norwegian Social Forum for inviting me to explain what Goa Foundation and the future we need are thinking and talking about regarding mining. And thanks, fellow panelists, also for and the audience for taking the time off to listen to this. I'm going to try and be a little bit short so that we can spend more time with the conversation after this. So at the heart of what we're asking for an idea called intergenerational equity to be implemented. So what is intergenerational equity? The idea is simple. What we inherit, we must make sure that our children and future generations also inherit. If we do that properly, then we have the right to any income that the inheritance creates. But if we as a society or as a people, if we start consuming a part of our inheritance and each generation takes a little bit of the inheritance, then soon enough we'll reach a point where there's nothing left. And civilization will collapse. Now, how does that apply? This is a nice idea, and if you think about it, there are many ways we actually implement this in general. So, if you start at the lowest level, and if you think about families, there is a old tradition that the rich families basically passed the estate on to their children, maybe one child or something, but the idea was that the estate goes on to the child. And there's also the idea that, you have somebody who's inherited wealth and just wastes it, and that's, morally wrong. You again have things like endowment funds where you keep the corpus whole and you only use the income. So this idea of intergenerational equity is fairly common practice. Now, the second thing that we think about is when we look at minerals, from our perspective, minerals are inherited wealth. And mining is effectively the sale of this wealth. So what we're getting in return is basically we must make sure that future generations inherit this. Now, I work in Goa, and we did an analysis to figure out what is it we are receiving of the value of the minerals that is being extracted and sold. We did a calculation for 8 years using the annual reports of the largest mining company, and here's what we found. If we take the amount of minerals that was sold and subtract the full cost of extraction and also say that the extractor has to get a reasonable profit, but all the value after that belongs to Goa in totality. So if you consider that to be 100, it turns out that over an 8-year period, the state of Goa, as the owner of the minerals, was getting less than 5. Now, this is an absurd state of affairs, but it's basically what's happening from this. I mean, the one important thing to think about is that since the minerals are owned by everybody in the state as well as all future generations, everybody is losing equally. So this is the equivalent of a per head tax applied on everybody, making a few miners very rich. You can also think of it as a negative basic income because we're taking an equal amount away from everybody and giving it to some people and making them rich. The second part of the problem that we found in Goa was that the five that the government was receiving by way of royalty, they were calling it revenue. And this is how governments all over the world treat royalty. They call it revenue. Revenue is basically income, so they happily spend that also. So basically, future generations are going to get zero out of the minerals that got extracted. We basically consumed everything. So how do we rectify this? We've come out with 5 basic principles that we believe apply in Goa, in India, and in most parts of the world. So let me take you quickly through them. The first principle we have is natural resources, including minerals, are a shared inheritance where the state is the trustee on behalf of the people to make sure future generations uh, inherit. A state is a trustee on behalf of the people and especially future generations. So this is the idea of public trust doctrine or public domain. In the global commons, it's called the common heritage of humankind. Principle 2, we have inherited the minerals, so we must make sure our children inherit either the minerals or their value. Now, of course, we can just leave the minerals as they are and our children will inherit them. That means intergenerational equity. But if we decide to extract and sell the minerals, we must ensure zero loss. The minerals are worth 100, we must get 100. Because the loss is unacceptable, we're basically all, it's a negative basic income and redistributed. Principle 4, whatever we receive from selling our minerals, like Norway, and we're speaking in Vienna for Vienna, Norway, and the Norwegian Social Forum, the whole world recognizes that what Norway does is the right thing here. You take all the money from mining and save it in the oil fund. And that ensures that future generations at least should inherit that value. Principle 5, we own the mineral, we own the fund which has been created from the mineral, we own the real income of that fund, distribute it equally to everybody as a commons dividend. Today we get the commons dividend, our children will inherit the fund and they will get the dividend in their turn. So these are the 5 basic principles. Now, if you think about it from an economic standpoint, if you compare it to what's happening with mining all over the world, this is a massive improvement. First of all, the government and the commons itself are sustainable because you're not reducing the value, you're saving the value and making sure that you're not reaching that critical threshold where everything is consumed. Secondly, because you're not consuming the money but actually saving it, this should increase the growth in the economy. Third, what's happening is that the income is being paid out as a dividend, which is, of course, also a form of universal basic income. And this audience probably recognizes that that itself has massive economic benefits. Fourth, some of that basic income will also be saved, which will further grow the economy. And fifth, what's going to happen is because inequality will be reduced, or actually the increase in inequality will be reduced because you're not losing money and making a few people rich. Everybody's getting the basic income, which is again very equal. Inequality is reduced, and even the IMF has understood that lower inequality means higher economic performance. And finally, what happens in the structure is the government does not get the ability to just extract minerals and spend it. So it forces the government to tax and spend, which will improve both the quality of taxation and the quality of public spending. So that should be a sixth gain economically. So overall, this is a massive improvement. If you think about it from an ethics or sort of the other kinds of value standpoints, this is obviously very fair. The mining company, the extraction company is getting what there is due. Everything else is being saved correctly for the future generations, and the income that's coming out is being distributed equally to everybody as owners. Now, this basic idea is you start with minerals, you create a fund, and you pay out a dividend. Now, you can take the same idea into other kinds of commons. Let's take the opposite extreme, which is spectrum or mobile telephony, sort of radio waves. Now, that is a completely renewable resource. So you don't have to create a fund. You can just take the money that mobile telephony companies are paying the government for the use of the spectrum commons and just pay that out equally to everybody as a dividend. And of course, you can do this with other kinds of commons. You can do this with Henry George talked about the land value tax. I believe Henry George was a big influence on the way Norway manages its oil. And even you can have things like carbon tax plus a fund plus a dividend. So you have many kinds of things like that. Specifically for Norway, I'd just like to say that the initial data I looked at suggested that you all did very well on zero loss, but there's been a very recent paper by Knut Anton Moore who suggests that you're actually losing in an indirect fashion maybe 50% of the value of your North Sea oil. Of course, Norway is doing a brilliant job with saving the fund. But if you think about this whole structure, the most important thing is the dividend, because the dividend is what creates a connection between the people and that mineral or the fund. And Norway is currently not paying out a dividend. And to some extent, I believe this is a risk. And this is something which even the IMF has talked about, because the government has overcommitted in terms of pensions. And if Norway has to keep its overall government wealth where it is, then you need to actually have a fiscal consolidation of 10% of GDP. And this was before COVID. So it's possible that Norway could consider, instead of using the money from the fund into the budget directly, pay it out as a commons dividend and then tax it back, strengthening the overall quality of government and making sure that you don't have an unsustainable situation. So let me stop here. This is what we're trying to do. Thank you.
Thank you very much. That was very interesting. We have next on the agenda is Bady Balde. He's from the ITI. That's right, Bady?
Okay. Yes, that's correct.
Yeah, and you are in head of the African part of the ITI.
That's correct.
Yes, and you have a very good CV. I think you will just take it from here.
Thank you very much, and thank you to the Norwegian Social Forum for inviting me on this very important topic of reclaiming the commons, which is timely in many ways. So very briefly here, in terms of the concept of UBI principles, as I understand it, it relies on two important factors: sustainable tax base and political will. In theory, resource-rich countries should be in a good position to create the condition for UBI. But in practice, the tendency is for resource rent to be concentrated in in the hand of a few, often through corrupt means. We are all familiar with some of the most tragic cases, like the Democratic Republic of Congo, Libya, or Venezuela. We can go on. But in any of those countries, citizens in those countries are poor despite the natural resource wealth that their governments have. This is where the EITI comes in. The EITI is founded on the principle that natural resources are fundamentally common goods which belong to all citizens, born and unborn. So if you will, let me first spell out what that means. It means Extractive Industries Transparency Initiative. I know it's a mouthful, but the challenge that we are trying to address here is how to manage these natural resources that are fundamentally a common good to benefit all citizens. At the EITI, we use two approaches to tackle this issue. The first approach is citizen participation. The second is transparency. So on citizen participation first, which we call stakeholder engagement, we have an international standard that is implemented by all our member countries, where they are asked to create a stakeholder group at the national level, which includes civil society, companies' representatives, and the government. That group that we call a multi-stakeholder group exists in each of our 54 member countries, including here in Norway. So when you have that group, you then start implementing the other component of the standard, which focuses on the transparency across the entire value chain of natural resource management. So take, for example, if a government enters into a contract with a resource developer on behalf of its citizen, we ask for those contracts to be public. And we ask for citizens to be allowed to scrutinize those contracts, for the government to manage those resources derived from the development of those projects in a way that is beneficial to all the citizens. There are many components in the standard, in the EITI standard, that specifically target key aspects of resource management. So similarly, if there are the company that develop those natural resources, we ask that the beneficial owners of the company is also put in the public domain. This is because you want to have a certain level of accountability and understanding of the social responsibility that those companies have towards their citizens where they operate. The standard also asks for the information about production data and when companies pay taxes to government. So the rent that they pay for the exploitation of those resources and how those revenues are received and transferred, in the case of Norway, to the pension funds and so on. In other cases, it may be different, but the model remains the same, is how do you ensure that the revenues derived from development of these resources reach the intended purpose. Now, I must stress that we don't promote one particular vehicle for that. So UBI is just one approach that could work. So you take Alaska, for example, where UBI has proven to be an effective mechanism to manage the wealth, to manage and redistribute the wealth derived from the oil sector in that particular context. Here in Norway, of course, you have one of the world's largest sovereign wealth funds. But if you take other countries like Australia or Canada and so on, you can see multiple cases where countries have successfully managed their natural resources to improve the well-being of and benefit their citizens. If you take the information that you disclose in this EITR report over the last 15 years or so now, you will see that there have been more than $2 trillion that have been disclosed through this mechanism, which means companies disclosing the information to the government of effective payment that have been made. This is a substantial amount in some cases. Sometimes that would lend itself for a redistribution model similar to UBI. In other cases, that may not be a sufficient amount for such model. So you would need either additional resources, or you would need to find a more targeted way of distributing the resource or investing in the development of your human capital. That in itself can be will help you improve society more generally. So rather than being prescriptive on the vehicle, the EITI is promoting this open and transparent and constructive manner of managing the natural resource, and then let a public and well-informed public debate settle the point of what is actually the best mechanism in that particular circumstance for ensuring that the resources reach the intended beneficiaries. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for your brilliant introduction. And we have the third in the row is no one else than Guy Stanning. He has been working for UBI for a very long time, and he also wrote a book last year that was very close to our topic, Plundering of the Commons, it's called. And I also like to mention his newest book, Battling Giants, Basic Income Now. It sounds very interesting. I'm unfortunately, I haven't read those, but I sure have to find an opportunity. Please tell us more, Guy.
Well, thank you very much, and it's a nice opportunity to reflect on something which concerns all of us, which is that every society has had its commons, and the commons define society. You cannot have a society without a commons. And it's important to realize that a commons doesn't just reflect the nature which we inherit and the resources and the bounty of nature. Those are the natural commons. We also have a social commons, the institutions and the social fabric and the amenities that define us as a society. So Norway or Britain or India or any of the African countries that we've been talking about has its social commons, the institutions that were built up by previous generations that we as commoners have inherited. We also have our civil commons, the institutions of common law that are built up and give everybody, in principle, a sense of justice. They get access to representation and equality before the law. Those are the civil commons. We also have our cultural commons, the various amenities that reproduce our culture, whatever culture that might be. And we also have our knowledge commons. Thomas Jefferson famously said, "Ideas in nature cannot be made the subject of property." That is an essential statement of our knowledge commons. And yet, in modern globalization, more and more ideas have been turned into private property through intellectual property rights, through TRIPS that was passed in 1994, which gives any company or individual who registers a patent a monopoly income flow for 20 years, or in the case of pharmaceuticals, 40 years. Very relevant in the time of the pandemic. So I think it's important to think of the commons as embracing not just the things that Rahul was talking about, with which I 100% agree with him, but also the various aspects of our society. And it's very important for what I'm trying to advocate, because for my mind, what we have seen historically is that all of our societies have seen an erosion, a plunder, if you like, that's the title of my book, a plunder of our commons. And that is illegitimate. It's inequitable, and it is dramatically increased inequality over the centuries. And what we're trying to say in this argument about the erosion of our commons is that we need a system which compensates the commoners. That's all of us in the case of natural resources and our social amenities, that compensates to give everybody a return to the investment that past generations have made and the resources that have been created in the process. And I think that's an important starting point in the commons. Now, what I've been arguing is that a basic income is a matter of common justice. We go back to many figures in the past, notably Thomas Paine and Henry George, but many others as well, who actually argued that the resources and nature and the wealth we have, the public wealth we have been created by many, many generations before us. And if you allow for private inheritance of private wealth, which every government does, it says if your parents or grandparents created private riches, you could inherit them. This is a lot of something for nothing, obviously. And what about including public wealth and public inheritance? So I think it's important to conceive of a basic income as a common dividend. We have this collective wealth, and we should say that everybody in Norway, everybody in India, everybody in any of the countries covered by this discussion has an equal right to a common dividend. Now, of course, that principle goes into many of the things that Rahul raised earlier, including the principle of intergenerational equity, which among economists is called the Hartwick rule, which is that future generations have an equal right to the commons and to a share of the commons as current generations. So it would be totally immoral if we, the current generations alive today, were to take the benefits, the revenue that could be raised from selling off, giving away our commons, taking the revenue ourselves. That would be immoral, unjustifiable in ethical or philosophical terms. It should be preserved for future generations. Now that leads to a quandary when you come to think of the different types of commons that have been plundered in different ways. They've been plundered by enclosure, by privatization, by commodification, by neglect, by austerity, or whatever it might be. And most fundamentally, as I've showed in the book, which I hadn't expected, most fundamentally, even in Norway or in any European country, by colonization, by private equity obtaining our commons at a knockdown price and turning it into profit making. Now, it's in that context that what I've proposed, which is a variant of what Rahul has been talking about very eloquently and consistently over a number of years, and I totally support him in that, but we can broaden it beyond the entitlement to the proceeds of minerals or of oil. We all know that the Norwegian pension fund is an exemplary example of a commons fund. Of course, it's based on oil. Not every country has oil. You will run out of oil in Norway, but the principles of the Norwegian fund can be made more generalized. What I think is an agenda for progressives in the post-pandemic era is what we must revive the commons and also compensate every commoner for the loss of the commons to special interests. That leads to a reflection of how you do that. Now, among the commons, the environment that's out there, all the natural resources are part of the commons. Think of a number of things. The air is part of our natural commons. It belongs to all of us and it belongs to nobody. If you privatize the air or you privatize water, as been done in many countries, you deprive the commoners of something that is presumed to belong to all of us. But of course, the air has been plundered because of pollution. Pollution creates particles in the air which poison the air and affect our life expectancy, our health, and everything. Who plunders the air? The people and the institutions and corporations that create global warming, create the pollution of the air, and the rich people who participate in activities which cause air pollution are depriving commoners of their inheritance, which is clean air. Very simple thing. So in other words, what we're finding is this, very simple, but you can generalize this principle, then that the air is a commons. The rich are exploiting that commons, causing the pollution, and the poor tend to be in areas where there is high pollution of the air, where they have been deprived of good air. Where does that reasoning lead you? It leads to saying we should have a mechanism by which those who are polluting compensates those who are affected by the pollution disproportionately. It's that line of reasoning which leads me to advocate a commons capital fund, which is based on the same principles as the Norwegian pension fund, the same principles as the Goa fund proposals are, but it is more generalized. So you need a carbon tax. We need a carbon tax because without that, global warming is going to accelerate, and we as a species and all the species around us are endangered. And we're going to see more viruses, we're going to see more pandemics, and so on. Therefore, we need a system of levies, or taxes if you like, on those who encroach on our commons. our air, our water, our land, our resources, our minerals, and so on, based on principles of intergenerational equity, of social memory, of public trust doctrine, and so on, that promote intergenerational equity. My fund that I've proposed in the book has 17 levies, where you say, for example, land has been taken by a minority who've benefited fantastically historically. Most of the land has been taken illegitimately without being earned by merit. And you basically say, along with Thomas Paine and Henry George, that the rental income should be taxed and put into a fund that, as it's built up, can pay out common dividends. Now, I think it's important in thinking along that line, because you can extend it to many spheres. Along that line, you have to say, well, what is the principles on which you justify building up a fund and then distributing the dividends to people? And I think it's important in that regard to say that you have different principles according to different types of resources on which you're getting the levies. In the case of minerals or oil or various things that are exhaustible resources, then you should be giving out to the current generation a social dividend that is a return on the investment made from the revenue generated, capital revenue. So in the case of the Norwegian fund, for example, roughly speaking, year after year, the fund earns 6% in gross terms, which reduces to 4% in net terms after management costs and so on have been taken into account. That 4% be redistributed equally, because we're all equal commoners, to everybody in society. But in other cases where you are taxing the rents, where the resource that you're taxing, the commons, if you like, is renewable and not exhaustible, then you can distribute a much greater percentage of the returns, the income that you create. I think that's important because it means that in principle, you're not restricted to giving just 4% of the fund that you've created. You're able to recycle in equal basic incomes, equal social dividends. The last point I want to make is that since the pandemic struck, I have been inundated with media and webinars about basic income from all over the world. We suddenly have a moment where millions of people suddenly realize the virtue of basic income as an anchor, as a base for a new income distribution system. And the lesson the world is learning is that the resilience of society depends on the resilience of the most insecure people and groups in society. If certain groups are left vulnerable and insecure, all of us will be left vulnerable and insecure. And I think this basic lesson is being learned and being understood by millions of people. Millions of people already understood it. It's seeping into the intelligentsia, it's seeping into the political discourse, it's seeping into public discussion. And may it seep much stronger. But I think that gels, that comes into alignment with what we're talking about reviving the commons. Commons we need. The commons reduces inequality, reduces insecurity, is part of our psyche, our society. Reviving the commons is a very good entry point to believe in the great virtues of the great Trinity, égalité, liberté, fraternité, or solidarité. And I think this is a moment where the commons lends a legitimacy to the pursuit of basic income. And that is why I'm happy to be involved in this discussion this afternoon. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. It was very, very interesting. And since all of you have been into the Norwegian pension fund, I thought I should just give a brief history of it. Because in the beginning, the neoliberals in Norway said that all this money should be divided on the Norwegians. It was not accepted. It could be a universal basic income, but I think the history showed us that it was a good idea not to give all the money to the people in one. And the problem also is that it's too much money. Actually, it's too much wealth, and but that led me to another. But we shall find a good way to distribute universal basic income in Norway. That I promise you, if we are allowed, of course. But this led me to one thing that you may not ever heard of before, but it's when you talk about natural resources or the basic resources, if we could leave the value in the mined minerals all the way to the in the value chain, and then you will have a lot more value for the miners, or in the for what you get out of the mines and the commons. I guess that would be something, transferring money from Norway to India, and not a bad idea. What do you think, Rahul?
It's gone.
It's gone. No.
If you're transferring money from Norway to India, I don't think anybody in India is going to object. Of course. But there's a slight size difference. We are you're about like 5 or 6 million population. So the fund income looks big there, where 1.3 billion or 1.4 billion, who knows? It's like many times larger. Yeah. But it is a good idea to, there is a question that I think in Norway is sort of coming up with the whole question of who's responsible for climate, and, is Norway responsible for exported emissions? So that may be a reason to send some money across to India.
You're stretching it.
No, but there is a judgment in the Oslo court that says Norway does carry a responsibility. So if there is a responsibility, and as you eloquently put it, clean air is no longer clean. So, and we are part of the commons, of the global commons. So yes, we would like some.
Bady, do you have a comment to this?
Yeah, well, it's an interesting point. I mean, it does have, if you think of, if you follow Guy Standing's excellent presentation there about the principle of the polluters pay, which within the nation states, that's, if I understand you correctly, that's what you are recommending there. From the climate perspective, obviously there is no barriers, there is no how should I say, climate change does not respect official borders for the nation states. So you could envision a situation where if you expand that concept of the polluters pay, so nations who have contributed the most to the pollution, to the climate change, there could be a situation where they could, if not compensate, but certainly contributed in mitigating the effects on some of the vulnerable communities who are most affected by the climate change and who are not well equipped, in fact, to address those changes. So if you think of, let me give you an example of the communities living around the Lake Chad. Well, Lake Chad is one of the biggest used to be one of the biggest lake in the world. And from 1965 to 1990, the lake has lost 90% of its size, its water. So as the lake shrinks, communities that depend on fishing and all the livelihood depending on this, around the ecosystem of the lake, obviously their lives have been turned upside down. And that has created all kinds of problems, migrations and refugees and so on. Those are communities that are victims of climate change today. And we have not found a good way of helping address those who have been victimized by those effects through no fault of their own, basically.
Yeah.
If I can just add out here, there's an organization called the World Basic Income. Full disclosure, I'm an advisor there, which is asking for basically a carbon charge to be applied not at the point of consumption but at the point of extraction, because it's easier to impose a charge at that point and then put the money into a global commons fund and then pay out a global commons dividend. And in a similar way, Goa Foundation is looking at the issue of minerals in deep sea minerals in international waters, which are considered the common heritage of humankind. And mining, the rules for extraction there are just being set. And we are again proposing something very similar. Basically, get the full value of that mineral, put it into a global commons fund, and then pay out a global commons dividend. World Basic Income, they are actually suggesting that the fund itself also go into be invested in environment and socially, so ESG investments, which are now showing better returns than just the plain market. So you can actually get a double benefit in that manner.
I do have questions for Guy Standing.
Yes, please.
Yeah, so I mean that's an interesting concept. I would like you to walk me through some of your thinking about the political feasibility of such funds. Is this a nation-state-driven fund? Is this a global fund? And given where at least recent trends in terms of lack of cooperation at the international level across nations, how do you see what would be the prerequisite for such funds to exist and be sustainable?
Well, I think first and foremost, it's a good question. I think first and foremost, we would have to extend national commons capital funds. And I particularly like the concept that's in Nigeria and a few other African countries of an intergenerational futures fund. You know, the name conjures up what is really being involved here. I think that if you think of the commons in this fivefold sense that I think of it, then you can not just concentrate on getting the rental income from the extraction of minerals or gold or whatever it might be, oil and so on, but you can also say the extraction of value from acquiring land. And in that regard, I think that the levies on the loss of the commons is a matter of saying those who are gaining from taking the commons must compensate the commoners for their loss. So I think, for example, that there are about 80 countries now which have sovereign wealth funds. Most of those funds are based on oil or minerals and natural resources. Okay? But I don't think that should be a restriction. So any country could establish a commons capital fund. Value of land is increased by the fact that only a minority own land. And the smaller the minority, the greater the value of land, because they create a sense of contrived scarcity and drive up the price of available land. So there's a very, very strong case for a land value tax. Every country, in my view, should have a land value tax. It is much better to tax wealth in its various forms than to tax income, earned income. It's easier, particularly in a globalized economy. So you should start with a land value tax. You should start with a wealth tax. We are in an era of rentier capitalism, globalized rentier capitalism, where the returns to the ownership of assets, including land, but any other property, have been going up and up and up everywhere in the world, relative to the returns to labor, to the returns to work, to the returns to production. And unless we do something like capturing the rental value of property, of assets, we will just see more and more inequality, more and more insecurity, and loss of resilience in the case of shocks. Millions and millions of people today are plunged into destitution by this pandemic because they have no resilience. Unless we alter our income distribution system, that resilience will get weaker and weaker. And that is a lesson we're learning, as I mentioned in my talk. And I think building up a commons fund starting with a levy on property, a levy on pollution, a levy on taking the minerals and turning them into windfall gains, we need to do that as a matter of urgency. And in doing so, every single country, I'm working in Africa at the moment on the blue commons, on the idea that we're seeing industrial capital taking the blue commons, taking the fish stocks, taking the minerals from the sea, even from the exclusive economic zones around every African state that is bordering the sea. It's not only what Rahul was talking about, the deep sea, the area as it's called, which is regarded as common heritage of humankind. My view is that actually could be converted into a global commons, and if there is any mining or activity permitted in that area, then that revenue belongs to all of us as a global commons. But what we do know is that every African state bordering the sea has an exclusive economic zone for 200 nautical miles out from its seashore. In my view, any industrial plunder of the fish stocks, of the minerals, of the oil, whatever it might be, owes the country that owns that EEZ a rental income, which should be put into a fund for that country. I've just been studying what's happening off the coast of Namibia, where they've just auctioned off to private capital their fish stocks. It's a disgrace, okay? And there's undoubtedly corporate state criminality that's taken place where they're sharing between a narrow elite and the foreign capital that's getting these contracts the rental income from depleting the fish stocks of Namibia. But those fish stocks are part of our natural resources, they're part of the commons of Namibia, a country I know well. So for me, you can generalize this argument to something that goes beyond minerals, goes beyond land, goes beyond various other things, and says this is our commons. And a matter of common justice, every commoner should get an equal share. That's the principle we're talking about. And I think we're on the same page on that. It's a matter of how you design it, making sure it's an independent concept, it's an independent fund with a separate governance and so on. These are second degree important issues, but they're second degree.
But can I push Kjell, if I can follow up on that? I mean, I'm going to be a little bit of a devil's advocate here, but you know, in the literature, there is also the point that citizens, when they contribute, they pay taxes, they contribute to a common, they get to hold their governments accountable. So in a way, they are investing in the common resource, and the government is managing that, and therefore there is an accountability mechanism. Now, if you have a system in which funds are going from the state to the citizen first as an income, don't you invert the dependency relationship, and by so doing also erode the level of accountability? Therefore, the state no longer feels like it's accountable to its citizens because it is managing the funds that's being redistributed to the citizen rather than the other way around, citizen paying taxes. What do you say to that?
Well,
Yeah.
I'm sure Rahul will have something to say there. Just let me, first of all, come back on you. If you take a typical African case, and it's really very tragic in many respects. Many countries have wonderful or have had wonderful mangrove forests, mango swamps, mango environments, right? And those environments have been plundered by corporate fisheries and aquaculture farms of shrimps and so on that have been allowed to take place in those commons. And as a result of that, huge number of Africans have been driven out of the mangrove ecosystems that had provided their livelihoods for generations and generations. They lost those commons, not because anything they did, not because they became unproductive or whatever, but simply because of the power of corporate capital. Now, for me, they are unable to pay taxes because they don't have an income on which to pay taxes. But they have been deprived illegitimately by enclosure and privatization that has taken place. And that's the same with what I was talking about with Namibia. The government per se should have been a trustee, a steward for the public wealth, the fish stocks, the wonderful fish stocks that exist of Namibia, instead of which a narrow elite has sold off in an auction a huge amount of the social wealth of Namibia to industrial fisheries. Some of their boats are 200 meters long, and they are having nets that trawl the sea and will deplete the fish stocks within a decade, so that in a decade, Namibia will not have a fishing industry worthy of the name, And the villages that for centuries were commons, living and reproducing the beauty of that sea. And I've been out there, it's beautiful. And it has fantastic resources, marine ecosystems. But there's no compensation. Of Mauritania, we now have BP mining oil in the world's biggest deep water reef, destroying an ecosystem in a few years that has existed for millions of years. And you are seeing this depletion of the natural commons without any compensation to humanity. For me, this is a plunder that's taking place, and the blue economy and the blue commons are at the forefront. But the things that Rahul and others have been talking about are the traditional things, the mining on land. But now we're seeing it taking place in an exaggerated way in the blue economy, which is two-thirds, more than two-thirds of the total planet. And so the scale of it is becoming awesomely destructive. And we're not preserving the value of the capital, of nature, of the commons, and we've lost the principles of commons. What I'm arguing for is a resurrection of the principles of the common, of which a basic income system and a commons capital fund, which is geared to intergenerational equity, are instruments for resurrecting the commons. That's my argument, basically.
Can I add something here? And also this fish story from Namibia sounds like something they've learned from the Norwegian. And I'm not suggesting that is right. But we do the same arrows here and export them, maybe. But I like your idea, Guy, but the broad view of commons. And in Norway, we have one thing that is the trust, the trusting people. That's one of our biggest value, because there's maybe a problem with making a trusting fund for UBI. But as Bady was saying, he was talking about corruption in Africa, and I mean, there's a balance here. What comes first? Shall we get rid of the corruption, or shall we establish trust from UBI, for instance, and then get rid of the corruption? Yes.
May I come back on that?
Yeah. Okay.
May I come back on that? Norway, besides having the biggest commons fund in your pension, your oil-based pension fund, also happens to be the center of the biggest seafood company in the world, Mowi, M-O-W-I, and it's owned by a gentleman who gave up his Norwegian citizenship for tax reasons and other reasons. And Mowi is the biggest aquaculture company in the world. It is now producing more than half the world's salmon and trout. It's an extraordinary phenomenon. And it goes everywhere, and it plunders the sea commons wherever it goes. And it doesn't pay for the externalities. 2 weeks ago, a storm hit one of its farms off the Scottish coast. That farm had 550,000 salmon. About 50,000 of those salmon were killed in the storm, and about another 50,000 escaped. And because they're full of antibiotics and various other things that protected them, they are going to infect the free salmon, the wild salmon in Scotland. And they're going to do huge damage. And whenever I hear of the talk about corruption in Africa, I get very angry because basically this plundering by private capital in the blue economy is also corruption, because they have done deals, they have got quotas, they have got systems of privilege, a tax avoidance and evasion. They have all sorts of systems of subsidies that enables them to go on long distance journeys to plunder the sea in the area that Rahul was talking about. So you can look at this process and say that actually what is happening in the sea is a crimogenic industry. That in itself justifies a statement that we, the commoners, every single person, Norwegian, African, whatever you want to call it, has a right to preserve and obtain a return on this plunder, and a return that is justifiable in demanding that those who are plundering pay and compensate and restore, key word, restore the commons that they are depleting. And that's why Rahul is 100% right for emphasizing this principle of intergenerational equity. Maui has no right to deprive our future generations of access to a marine ecosystem that is rich as it is today. And I think this sense of anger must translate into our sense of politicizing the whole issue of the commons. That's why I think this subject is a very rich one and a very political one. The basic income is merely part of it. It's merely part of this discussion about reviving the commons.
Right, yeah, Rahul, you have been silent for a while. Maybe you have some comment.
Yeah, I'll just try and respond to a little bit of stuff which came earlier, mostly to Bady. First thing, I just want to point out that, you think that Australia did very well in management of its minerals, but actually there's a Australian government data which shows that for the decade 2000 to 2010, for all the minerals that were extracted in Australia, the government received just 18% of the value of the minerals. Sorry, I just lost power, but you can't see me, but you'll be able to hear me. Okay. So Australia basically lost 82% of the worth of their minerals over a decade, and that explains a lot of the politics of Australia. That's one. Second, I want to just respond in terms of at least our structure, in terms of the political practicality of it, because it's an important question. Is it just a utopian idea? So the first thing is, let's just think about some of the various ways to look at it. From an economic standpoint, what we're basically saying is we own the mineral, we own the fund, we own the income from the fund. So if you believe in the idea of property rights, which everywhere from libertarian to communism, everybody believes in that, then this follows from it. If you don't believe in property rights as an indigenous person, then don't extract the mineral, and you've dealt with intergenerational equity also. So that's one part of it. Think about it from the point of view of civil society. Anybody interested in human rights will be interested in this idea because the dividend will actually will help the disadvantaged more than the advantaged. Though the amount is the same, somebody who's rich may not want the dividend, but somebody who's poor it'll help more. And somebody who's disadvantaged, let's say a woman or a child or somebody who's physically handicapped, or there are many categories of that, the same amount helps them more. So now you've got this very broad spectrum of people. And even on the conservative side, it has two things. One is it embodies the golden law of religion: treat others as you would want to be treated yourself. And think about things like the Rotary Club or the Lions Club, service organizations who are basically thinking that we do need to do good for society, but may not be in terms of environment and all of that. So in our estimation, you can probably get 70 to 80% of the population behind something like this. Now let's think about the politician. Why would the politician do this? Well, one important thing in our mind is that we need to figure out how to get them to stop calling uh, royalties as revenue. You've done this many times today, but this is a big issue because if it's called revenue, then you want to spend it. And the voter and the politician the politician stands up and says, let's extract minerals, we get revenue. And the voter says, yay, let's do that. Lower subsidy, higher subsidies, lower taxes, some roads get built. But the future generations don't get anything. So one part of it is a campaign we have separately to change government accounting standards because that's where the problem comes from. But now if you think about a politician, let's think about somebody we don't like probably out here, Trump. If Trump goes up and says, we're going to implement these principles, we're going to get the full value of the mineral, create a sovereign wealth fund for the US from the oil in, let's say, Gulf of Mexico and off the coast, which is owned by the national government, and we're going to pay a dividend to everybody. It will have enormous appeal. Now, there's no reason why somebody on the progressive side, Bernie Sanders, cannot make the same pitch. Right? It could be somebody who wants to leave a legacy. It could be something in Nigeria where you have ethnic conflict, and this is a way to get everybody to feel that they're being treated equally. So you can have that kind of a situation. So there are multiple places where this is, in my mind, politically feasible and actually practical as a solution to problems that we all have. So let me hand it back to you, Kjell, but I just wanted to add these bits in.
I have to mute myself. Thank you, Rahul. This is a wise speak. I think it's. What do I think about? I think we take. We have a question from one of the who look listeners here, looking at us. What do you call it? viewers. As she wants to review the commons through a conventional tools as complementarity community currency. Did you understand that one?
Yeah, I can try if I understand the question. So it's apart from okay. So how about reviving the commons through convivial tools such as complementary community currencies? Okay. Maybe, I mean, if you think of it is feasible in the normal sense to every time you create a common fund, you are essentially creating a currency because it's a share. Everybody has a share in that, and therefore you have the value of the saving value in that fund in a way. Now, do you complement with a currency? I can think about a few examples in some relationship between mining communities and resource extracting companies in certain countries where they had to contract. It actually, there's a good example in the United States where companies have to have a long-term contract with citizens living around a certain area. I think it's in the state of Colorado for an extended period to say, if you can operate in this area, these are the parameters, and you are allowed to use this land, but under these conditions. So, and that's a contract not between the company and the government, but rather between the companies and the citizens, the communities living there. And as part of the implementation of that process, obviously, we have now seen that those kind of contractual agreements can get eroded over time. But you could envision in situations like that, where the resources being combined from the companies as part of that is, in a way, almost like a mini deposit in a mini central bank for the local community, which would then disperse those funds to those local communities. So it's that would be my first hunch to that, but I wouldn't say going as far as complementary community currencies. If you think various exchanges methods that are coming up right now, one that is very interesting is actually blockchain and other models of distributed way for communities to cooperate. There is a beautiful model about actually solar panels and just a distributed grid, and how you can create a different mechanism of exchange based on that. It's a combination between the distributed grid, the use of cell phone as a mean of transfer of funds across communities. Using those two things, you find yourself where money becomes less tangible, as you will. It becomes an exchange of goods, which in this case was excess of electricity produced by this panel in this household, by the need this household that has less of solar panel resources to produce electricity, and the mean of transacting is through these cell phones, and they are getting credits and withdrawing depending on who owes who and so on. It's almost barter, but using a digital currency, if you will. That's normally feasible in a theoretical manner, but it goes back to the point you made, Kjell, that all those frameworks depend on high degree of trust for the communities that are transacting. Because if there is no trust in that system, it's hard to envision how such system would function. But I'm not so sure. It's hard in this online audience, so it would have been easier to get the reviews what they were trying to get at.
Yeah, but thank you. I think.
Can I just take that?
Sure. Go ahead.
Can I just add to that? So community currencies are a fairly old idea. There's the famous current one is the Bristol pound, but Silvio Gesell back after the Great Depression came up with this idea that a local city actually it was tried in a few places where the local city issue their own currency, and they use people without jobs. They did certain kinds of social work, got paid in the currency. They went back to the local shops. They spent with that currency, and that kick-started the overall local economy. There's a very interesting experiment going on in a city in Brazil called Marica, which is actually currently paying out a citizen's dividend based on this idea. And there's a equivalent kind of a thing in Gyeonggi-do province in South Korea, which is paying out a youth basic income through a local currency, which is only usable in that district. But if I can just take the question to a slightly different level, the question is about reviving the commons through creation of new commons in a sense. Creating a new community currency, or we can create little common kitchens, and there are many kinds of things. It could be a garden where people have their own patches of land. So one way to reviving the commons is to create your own commons. The second way is to remember that you actually are part of certain commons. There are many commons today which operate and even pay out dividends. I mean, a cooperative is basically a commons. So there's that. And then lastly is to remember that you used to own commons in the past, and those are being gradually plundered, as Guy has put it. So there are different ways to doing it, and certainly creating new commons is a good way to bring back the spirit of commonwealth.
Mm. Mm.
Thank you. I was thinking about this movie story, which is a very good guy. It's they have taken a lot of our comments and make a fortune, but it also shows that even Norway are the best country in the world to live in. We are scoring as number 147 in sustainability. So there we have a lot to do. So that's actually how we plunder not only our own commons, but also the world commons. And Mowai, they get a lot of soya from Brazil, huge area they use in Brazil to feed their stock. So yeah, we have to maybe plunder more of our own fjords to feed this fish.
Don't do that. They're already overplundered. They're already.
Don't do that. Yeah, Norway is actually one of the few countries on the mining side to allow mining waste to be put into the ocean. There's a copper mine up in, and you're happily dumping the waste. It's really poisonous, but into a fjord.
Yeah,
It's
that's
amazing.
so. This news have reached India as well. It's very embarrassing.
Yeah. Quite right. Quite right. All right. All right. I think we finished, right?
Yeah, I think we have 10 minutes, but I think this will be a very nice way to call it a day. I think it's been a very interesting discussion, conversation. Very nice to meet you all. Very nice. Thank you very much to all that have been watching us, and will watch us later on YouTube or wherever you find the video.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, I think we stop there, Olaf.